Welcome to our special podcast series for the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, running from November 25th to December 10th, with your host, Sharmin Prince. And together, we'll shine a light on some of the urgent issues of gender-based violence. In this series, we'll delve into personal stories, legal insights, and share vital resources that empower individuals and communities to take action. Our goal is to raise awareness, ignite conversations, and advocate for change in our societies. Join us as we embark on this critical journey to stand against violence, uplift survivors, and promote a world free from fear and abuse. Let's get started. Welcome to our special podcast series for the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, running from November 25th to December 10th, with your host, Sharmin Prince. And together, we'll shine a light on some of the urgent issues of gender-based violence. In this series, we'll delve into personal stories, legal insights, and share vital resources that empower individuals and communities to take action. Our goal is to raise awareness, ignite conversations, and advocate for change in our societies. Join us as we embark on this critical journey to stand against violence, uplift survivors, and promote a world free from fear and abuse. Let's get started.
I am your host, Sharmin Prince, and this is the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence Awareness Series. Today, I have Dr. Eleanor Nwadinobi, who is a distinguished medical doctor and a renowned expert in women peace, security, and gender issues, holding a master's degree in human rights. She made history as the first Nigerian to serve as the international president of the Medical Women's International Association, MWIA, a position she occupies in a century-long legacy of organization. She actively engages in meaningful initiatives, serving on the boards of several national and international organizations, including the Every Woman Treaty, a coalition dedicated to establishing a global binding norm to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. Additionally, she is the co-chair of the Immunization Agenda, IA 203, Partnership Council. Of course, she's a prolific author. Dr. Nwadinobi has produced numerous publications and has been recognized with various awards for her significant contributions to advancing women's rights and health. Welcome to the Anything Gender podcast.
Thank you so much, Sharmin. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you so very much for your very gracious compliments and welcome today. Thank you.
You are very welcome, and I honor you. You are worthy of that honor.
Truly humbled. I'm truly humbled and honored. Thank you, Sharmin.
You're welcome. So, can you explain what gender-based violence encompasses and why is it such a critical issue in our world today?
Sharmin, I really wish that I could address gender-based violence as something in the past, as something in the history books, relegated to the history books. But sadly, gender-based violence, which is any form of violence, physical, emotional, verbal, that brings harm to any human on account of their gender is gender-based violence. And I am unapologetic about speaking to gender-based violence, specifically against women and girls.
Mm-hmm.
Why do I say that? Because globally, more than 1 in 3 women and girls are raped, beaten, or assaulted, which makes that of pandemic proportions. It makes that an existential threat. And can you believe the United Nations Entity for Women, UN Women for short, in September of last year, just over a year ago, reported that no country is within reach of eradicating intimate partner violence, and that as a global community, we are failing women and girls.
Yeah. Thank you. As a medical professional, how do you perceive the role of healthcare providers in addressing and helping to not just combat GBV, but participate in the prevention and the raising of awareness?
We have a very critical role to play as healthcare providers. But before I narrow down into our role as healthcare providers, Sharmin, I'd like to say that the prevention of gender-based violence, and in particular, violence against women because they are women, is the whole of society and the whole of government's business. It can't be left to one sector of the population alone. But having said that, we as healthcare professionals, we are the frontliners. We need to be able to recognize intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, whatever type of violence it is, when that violence walks into our consulting rooms. If a young lady comes in to say she has a broken arm, she thinks she has a broken arm because she fell down the stairs, we need to have our antenna up to ask those searching questions in an empathetic manner, confidential manner, because she may have been pushed by her significant other. She may have been running away from intimate partner violence. Can you imagine I'll quote UN Women again. Their headline for the 16 days of activism this year is that every 10 minutes, partners and family members killed a woman intentionally. The operative word there is intentionally in 2023 alone. So as healthcare professionals, we, according to the International Labour Organization, are 70% of the health workforce. So the first thing is for us to recognize survivors of violence. Then we need to ensure that we participate in prevention messages. And as the Medical Women's International Association, what we do in particular is to break down in the simplest of forms, in language that communities can understand, going to the hard-to-reach, underserved, vulnerable populations, rural areas, reaching those who feel that they are voiceless, bringing that message to them to say that, one, they can speak up so that we can crush the silence and the stigma, and also speaking to community leaders, faith leaders, governments, so that they can put in place preventive measures, and also ensuring that reporting mechanisms are accessible and responded to promptly and efficiently in a way that perpetrators are brought to book, and that we also break the culture of silence and deal effectively with the culture of impunity.
I'm going to ask you about the last statement. Break the culture of silence and
the culture of impunity.
Yeah. Can you expand on that a little more?
Oh, most certainly. What you will find out is that as horrendous and unacceptable as the numbers that I have stated, where I said the data coming out of the World Health Organization, that globally more than 1 in 3 women are raped, beaten, or assaulted, those numbers are actually underreported because women and girls in particular find it difficult to report. There are cultural impediments. You find that a young girl, for example, in a rural area, there's such a premium placed on marriage that even when she goes to somebody she trusts, like her own mother, she will be told, don't report that you have been raped because you won't find a husband. So that fear of the stigma, that fear that she won't be accepted, but worse than that, is where the global community fails such women and girls because the incentive to report is not there. What do I mean by that? Number one, she has to go through all the barriers of reporting. If she goes to the police, if the police and the law enforcement agencies are not trained to take her report seriously, confidentially, and not to re-traumatize her. For example, asking her, why were you wearing a revealing blouse? Or why were you out late at night? They haven't asked her if she was working 2 jobs while she was returning late at night. But they are already making her the one that has to bear that burden. She's already been re-victimized. She might have to overcome yet another hurdle of looking for resources that she does not have to get legal assistance. And in some countries, you find out that the legal system is not wired to support survivors. Either it's too expensive, or as I've said before, the burden of proof is upon her. And then the perpetrator, who may have power and privilege in the society, gets away with it because of the power and privilege that they have, or that they can pay a lawyer, or that cases are adjourned so that justice is delayed and denied the survivor or the victim. So that's why I said we must break the culture of silence, providing the survivor support, legal aid. We must provide a safe space and a shelter so that we can take her out of the offending and offensive environment. I recall during COVID, when women were locked down with their perpetrators. These are women who would normally go to work or to the market, and they would be able to escape for a fair amount of hours from their perpetrators. But they were locked down in situations with the very people who perpetrated intimate partner violence. And it was the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres of the United Nations, who said, let there be a ceasefire behind the closed doors of our homes. I've only heard ceasefire in the context of guns and ammunitions and war. But he was quite correct in referring to the situation that women and girls were in at home, because the home was not a safe space.
I'm happy that you mentioned General Secretary Antonio Guterres, because during the pandemic, he called gender-based violence the shadow pandemic. And I'm linking it to what you said in the beginning about the numbers. And it is a pandemic. He highlighted it during the pandemic, but as the numbers, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men for the US. That's the statistics. And that's a pandemic, right? But no one is calling it that because it's behind the scene. It's not in your face. And there are a few things that I wanted to piggyback on. Faith leaders, we're going to talk about that because that community is so important in this fight for raising awareness, because a lot of community members trust the church, and that might be the first person in line to know someone is being abuse. And most of them might not be trained counselors. And they use the scriptures. I had a survivor who was also a friend, a pastor's wife, and was told that if she breaks the silence, the shame it will cause the church, the presbytery, and the entire district. It is so unfair for victims to be blamed and shamed, and then add the load to carry other people who are not involved in the relationship. Yes, the perpetrator should be the one thinking about those things, not the victim. So, how do we encourage our faith leaders to stop sending victims back to the perpetrator and using isolated scriptures? So,
Oh, Sharmin, you have so eloquently, laid out what's going on. First of all, call it the name, as unpalatable as it is. During COVID, we can be happy to say that the UN system came close in calling it the shadow pandemic. And as you said, the Secretary General in seeking for a ceasefire, we at the Every Woman Treaty called it the pandemic within the pandemic.
mm,
The world ran around, they scurried. The researchers worked night and day. They fast-tracked vaccine approvals for the COVID pandemic. Now, where is the vaccine? This pandemic of all pandemics, that's an existential threat. And you have touched a point that, we need to focus more on our faith leaders, because when we had COVID, we were locked down, locked in, locked away from family, friends, and faith. And the faith leaders of the different faiths, they have their adherents, their congregants, their followers, and they have that power to bring the correct and unadulterated message to their adherents. But unfortunately, there are those who misuse and abuse the pulpit. You can imagine if we had our faith leaders speaking up courageously. And as you said, not using isolated portions of scriptures or the holy books, but ensuring that they use them in a way that humanity as a whole, that every single man, woman, girl, and boy knows that they deserve their dignity, their respect, their human rights. and that there should be punishment for those who perpetrate such dastardly and heinous acts. I remember during COVID a case that sticks out with such sadness in my memory. A young girl who was reading for her exams and in a rural area, seeking a place in Nigeria, where I am from, where there was electricity. And she went to the church. In the church building, she was reading until late at night. And that's where she suffered gang rape and was murdered. And you begin to think, how can that happen? So we need our faith leaders to speak up. We need them to speak out. And we need them, as you say, not to use the scriptures in isolation, but to use them holistically. And as the Every Woman Treaty, we also look to laws. Right now, we have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is known as CEDAW. And CEDAW is beautifully crafted for discrimination. And in order to address violence against women, they have what is called General Recommendation 35, a beautiful recommendation that speaks specifically to forms of violence against women and girls. But it is a soft law. It's not a hard law. So we are calling for an optional protocol, which is a hard law, an optional protocol to CEDAW, because when we have a global binding hard law, then that is the start with governments. And that's what we are calling for.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning CEDAW. I have a question for that, but quickly before I ask about Every Woman Treaty, can you just tell us briefly what is CEDAW?
Yes, most certainly. First of all, it's a treaty. It's a convention out of the United Nations. Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And this was a groundbreaking anti-discrimination human rights treaty adopted as far back as 1979. In fact, many refer to it as the International Bill of Rights for Women. And it has been truly instrumental in advancing women's rights around the world. But when you imagine that in 1979, issues of violence, sexual violence in particular, harassment, those were seen to be private issues. So the original text of CEDAW did not actually mention violence, but as violence continued to happen, continued to escalate, CEDAW's text was improved, where issues of trafficking, forced marriage, honor killings were addressed via general recommendations. and in particular, General Recommendation 19 and General Recommendation 35. General Recommendation 19 was adopted in 1992, whereas 25 years later, then came General Recommendation 35, where the CEDAW committee was recommending to countries that they desist and work around prevention, protection, response to violence. But because it's soft law and not binding, it then meant that countries found it difficult to adhere to recommendations. Let me give you one example. I have had the opportunity of traveling from one place to the other. And when I get on an airplane, whether it's an international flight or a domestic flight, an announcement is made on the airline by the crew that smoking is totally, absolutely, unequivocally not allowed on the airplane. No matter where you are in the world, the airline crew have to make that announcement. It's not that long ago that people could smoke on aircrafts. They would sit at the back. Funnily enough, the back of the airplane was also where they put mothers who were nursing children in those days. But it's not a laughing matter. Because of a global tobacco treaty, no matter where you are in the world today, Sharmin, that announcement is made as part of adhering to the global tobacco treaty that smoking is not allowed on any aircraft. I would like to see a situation where those sorts of announcements are made regarding any form whatsoever regarding violence against women and girls. And that's why we are calling for an optional protocol to CEDAW, a global binding norm.
Thank you. And on that note, my call of action you. What can individuals and organizations do during the 16 days of activism to effectively contribute to the fight against GBV and to raise awareness?
Oh, thank you, Sharmin, because we want solutions. And one of the first things I said was that it's not just one sector of the population. We must make it our business. It's everybody's business. Being a bystander or being silent is not an option. And therefore, we are grateful for the 16 days of activism. It's 16 days from the 25th of November, which is Day Against Violence Against Women, to the 10th of December, Human Rights Day. It's 16 days of heightened awareness. But to be honest, every single day of the year, 365 days, or 366 if it's a leap year, every day should be a day of heightened awareness. When we have our antenna up, when we're looking out for our brothers and our sisters, to make sure that gender-based violence is relegated to the history books. And what can you and I do? The first thing that you and I can do, starting from the smallest unit, our families. How do we react behind the closed doors of our homes? How are we raising our children, boys and girls, to respect one another's rights and dignity? Taking it to the next layer, it's like an onion skin. In the community, in the extended family, in the community, in our nations, and then globally. Violence prevention education. Research has shown that violence prevention and education influences men and women, boys and girls' attitudes and actions. That behavior change communication in a way that women and girls can demand their rights, in a way that there's zero tolerance for incidents of violence, for governments to be held accountable, to be responsive and to be responsible, for us to have the legal reform that I've spoken about. And then, of course, training and accountability for doctors, nurses, lawyers, judges, to be trained so that when they do come across reports of violence, that they can respond appropriately. And then let's ensure that we have comprehensive systems of care, not just healthcare, helplines, shelters. When a woman has to relocate to stay out of harm's way, how can she be empowered to continue to earn? And, we can't ignore conflict situations. Let's make sure that, there are no safeguarding breaches so that people who have whatever power or privilege, let's say in an internally displaced person's camp, will not demand, sex for food stamps. And of course, the big elephant in the room, to be sure that there is ring-fenced, dedicated, set-aside funding by every government to address issues of gender-based violence. So we've had 15 countries call for the optional protocol. We've had the special rapporteurs on violence come together to call for the optional protocol to CEDAW. We have more than 3,000 women's rights activists and organizations in 147 countries calling for the optional protocol. We've had Nobel laureates like Jody Williams in the USA, Shireen Ebadi in Iran, and Tawakkol Karman in Yemen call for the optional protocol. We've had the special envoy to the African Union on women, peace and security call for the optional protocol. Sharmin, the time is now. The time is right. And the time is ripe for us to call for the optional protocol to CEDAW. And we can't do it alone. We have to lock elbows. Elbows locked. We can do it together.
Wow. Thank you so much. Oh, okay. But thank you for your time. And one thing you want to leave with our listeners? Go ahead.
I would just love to say to our listeners, everyone has a role to play to bring an end to gender-based violence, and in particular, gender-based violence against women and girls. We can do it together, elbows locked.
Thank you. Remember what Edmund Burke said. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. I am Sharmin Prince, and we will see you the next episode.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence podcast series. We hope today's discussions inspired you to take action and support those affected by gender-based violence. If you found value in this episode, please subscribe, share it with others, and leave us a review. Your voice is crucial in spreading awareness and advocating for change. Stay connected with us on social media at Eagles and Thank you for joining us on this episode of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence podcast series. We hope today's discussions inspired you to take action and support those affected by gender-based violence. If you found value in this episode, please subscribe, share it with others, and leave us a review. Your voice is crucial in spreading awareness and advocating for change. Stay connected with us on social media at Eagles Empower to Soar, EETS, and visit our website at www.eaglesoar.org. For more resources and information, let's continue this important conversation and work together to create a safer world for all. Until next time, take care and stand strong against violence.